Now, if you remember, when we were talking about the sitemap and file and the sitemap path, we talked about the notion of binding. And we talked about, in the notion of building things as components, how we're going to have components that contain data and then components that format and display that data. So we're going to need really a couple of components on our page that will, one of which is going to be used to hold the data, and one is going to be used to format and display the data. So there'll be a data component and there'll be a visual component. First thing we're going to put on the page is the visual component. And the first one of these that we're going to explore is the grid view. So I can put the grid view on the page. And by default, the grid view is going to display a little table that looks like this. All right. We can bind our data to any number of different visual controls. This is just the first one that we're using. All right. I'm then going to pick a SQL data source. This is going to be my data component. So this is going to be the second component that we're going to create. All right, this is going to be the data component. This will be the one that will be bound to the visual component. So I go and grab the SQL data source, bring it over, and if I click Configure Data Source, it's going to walk me through a wizard. Now, if I click on this drop-down, it's able to find that database that is in my app data folder. So I click on the drop-down, I select that database. All right? Because that's the database I want to connect to. I could potentially have an application connect to several different databases and piece stuff together, but in this case, this is what I want my data from. I click Next. Now, it's asking me if I want to store this connection in the application configuration file. You bet I do, right? Because what if something about that connection changes? What if this was an Access database and it changes to a SQL Server database? Or what if it's an Access database and the physical location of that database changes? Or what if it's a SQL Server database and the server name changes? Any of the parameters that deal with the connection, we want to store in one place. We don't want to have a separate connection on every single page, so that if the database changes a location or some other aspect of it, that we have to go and change all of our pages. So we're going to store the connection that we create in the web config file. Then, the next page that we create this for, we won't create a new connection. We'll simply use the one before, that we created before. So what I did is I picked from the drop-down, yes, I want the student access database, and yes, I want to save it, and I'll call it connection string. If I want to call it something else, I could. All right. Now, here's where we get to put our select statement in. All right. I'm going to go in and do this manually. All right. Because it's no fun taking the easy way. So I'm going to go and do this manually. So I'm going to say specify a custom SQL statement. And I can go in and I can simply paste my good old SQL statement that I have here. I can paste it in where it says SQL statement. I can click Next. Then I can click Test Query. And sure enough, it works, right? It shows me the output. And then I click Finish, and it has configured my data source. So now I have the visual component, which is the grid view, and I have the data component, which is a SQL data source. All I have to do is marry these two together. All right? All I have to do is combine them so that the one is bound to the other. I do that by selecting this, and where it says Choose Data Source, I go and I select Data Source 1. And now notice that it's showing me the headings from my actual column names.
Could you do that again?
Sure.
There.
Click on that, choose data source, and then you can choose a data source from the drop-down.
That's a grid for you that you drug over from the...
That's a grid view that I drug over, right. Now I can do nice things like auto-format this to give it a nice little look. We'll go with autumn. And we'll review other ways that you can customize that grid view if you want to. But for now, we'll go and run this. And we should have on our page the data from the database. And there we go. We have the data from our database on our web page. Now, a few things to point out. Let's look at that web config file. Just double click on it and look at it. Here is that connection string we just created. Ideally, and with rare exceptions, for the projects in this class, you ought to have just one connection string in there. We're not doing anything so complicated that involves multiple databases. So therefore, you're going to have one connection string. You could have 100 pages. You could have 100 different database activities going on in your application. But if they're all pointing to the one database, they should have just one connection string. And that's what got created the first time I went in and I clicked from the drop-down and picked my database. It created that connection string. All right. Now, if I wanted to do a second page, or let's say I wanted to put a second, let's do this. Let's put a second grid view on this page to show students. All right. What do I need? Well, for any database data that I want to view, I need the visual component, which is the grid view. I need the data source, which is a SQL data source. This time when I configure the SQL data source, I don't want to pick the student access database. I want to pick the connection string that I defined before. That'll use the same connection string as the other one did. That way, if something about it changed, all I need to do is go in that web config file, change the connection string, and every place that accesses the database would get that change.
Doesn't that connection string point to the faculty table, though?
No, the connection string points to the database. The data source that I created before points to the faculty table. In reality, what I did the first time is I actually did two things. The interface made it look like I was just doing one thing, but I was actually doing two. The first step is I was creating a connection string in the web config file that points to the access database. The second thing I did was create a data source that points to the faculty table. So now in this case, I still want to point to the same database. The second part of this will be different, and therefore the data source will be different because this one will point to the student table. All right, and I can go here and put in my select statement to say select star from student. I can test it, finish it, and then again, I can marry these two together and say the data for the second grid view comes from the second SQL data source. And so if I go and run this, then I have one grid that shows the faculty, another grid that shows the students underneath it.
And you have more than one student?
No, remember I changed cascade delete, so I got rid of the one student when I deleted my row from that table. Yes.
You say you're a CSS fan, but for like that top grid,
Yeah.
you went to that formatting.
Yeah.
Is there a way to do that in CSS, or is that kind of?
Well, that's a good question. You caught me at a weak moment, I guess. Remember, there's always a way to do it for CSS if you have some kind of hook into it. Now, what are your hooks into it? Your hooks into it could be a class, a particular HTML tag, or an ID, or some combination of those. So let's look at the student one, all right? Now, let's run this, and let's look at the HTML that gets generated for that grid. All right, right mouse, view source. The HTML that got generated for that, I have an ID. All right, so I can now reference that ID in my CSS. Okay, so I can go in here, create my CSS. No, I didn't want that. And I can say #grid view 2 with 100%. #grid view 2 th background #1 2 3 4 5 6 color black.
So TH.
Table headings. Table headings within that ID.
And that was a color number, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Well, that was me counting. I typed in 6 C's.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, I wanted
6 Cs.
it to be gray, so I want to make sure I got 6 C's instead of 5 C's or something like that. Now let's go in and apply to this page that style sheet. Now if we run this, nada. Let's look closer at this. Oh, the spelling of grid view is wrong. The capitalization is wrong. By the way, in this case, notice I didn't use very descriptive names for the grid view or the other objects. That's probably not a good idea. You know, it might be better to call this grid student, grid faculty. And there we go. There we get it the way that we want to. So yeah, remember, as long as you have a hook into it, and the hooks for CSS, classes, IDs, HTML tags, or a combination of those, then you can style it via CSS. My guess is that the developers of the ASP.NET framework wanted to make this simple for people that maybe were VB programmers or C# programmers that really weren't web folk, that weren't really proficient with CSS stuff. So they put some hooks in there to like automatically style stuff that way. There's a few options to do things a few different ways. Not to say per se there's anything wrong with any of the methods. It's just I tend to prefer the one to the other. All right. We're just going to build from this next time. We'll go in and we'll start doing things like, for example, filtering out. Maybe we don't want to see every student, but we just want to see students with a certain state, maybe. I guess we'll have to add state to the table. Or maybe we want to show the student with the name of their faculty advisor. So we'll just build on to these more involved selects. But the good news is that's basically it for doing selects with that. Visual component, data source, bind them together. All right? We'll build on this next time. All right? See you over in lab.